Hi, everybody. Welcome to Benchmarks 2021. Thanks for being so punctual and getting here right on time. I hope everybody enjoyed that wonderful Huey Lewis in the News intro. We're going to get started. I'm going to start doing a little housekeeping introductions here. As we do that, feel free to continue to join us in the chat to let us know where you are finding joy today. My name is Will Valverde. I am a Senior Creative Director at M+R and one of the co-writers of Benchmarks, our annual study of nonprofit data. I'm going to be helping to walk through all of the top line findings with you today. If you have any questions as we go through, you can drop them in the question and answer feature in Zoom. Also, please feel free to keep the conversation going in the chat when you find something that you are inspired by, intrigued by, interested in, that sort of thing. Theresa, you want to say hello?
Hello, I am Theresa Bugeaud. I am the Director of Data Analytics at M+R. This is my 9th Benchmarks, which is exciting. And I'm talking to you today from Detroit, Michigan.
Great. I'm in Rhode Island, and this is my, I don't know how many Benchmarks is. I think fewer than Theresa's, maybe like 8. She said 9. So we're going to get started. First, just for those of you who are not familiar with M+R, we are a consulting agency that works exclusively with nonprofits to do good in the world. A lot of the work that we do is focused on digital channels, and that's what we're going to be covering today. So that includes digital fundraising and advocacy, digital organizing, advertising, social media. We also do media relations work and really anything else that it takes to get good work done and to help to change the world. We are really excited to be able to share this data with you today. This is a reflection of the work that we do every day. These are the numbers that we are sort of always dealing with. And the Benchmarks study every year is a chance for us to step back a bit. And it's a chance for us to share what we're seeing with the broader nonprofit community, with all of you, to see if it's reflecting what your experiences are, to help set some context for this work that we're always doing. As much as we're in constant communication with each other in all sorts of channels these days, it can also feel very isolating to do this work and feel like, are the numbers that I'm seeing normal? Is this experience reflected in the broader community? So we're going to be able to get through that today a little bit. Before we dig in, I do want to take a moment to thank the participants who answered questions and provided data for our study. These are nonprofits that do amazing work all year round, and their willingness to also join into this effort is so generous. What you see here is a breakdown of the participants by sector. And as we go through the charts, you're going to see the data is typically broken out along these lines. So we provide an overall metric for any particular data point, and then we also break it out by sectors. Sometimes you are going to see a sector disappear from a chart. It's not going to be listed sometimes. When that happens, it's because we didn't have enough data from enough participants within that sector for that data point to give a reliable average. And so some sectors that have sort of smaller populations here, you can see there are 7 public media participants. So the public media sector may drop off of some slides because we don't have enough data for them. If you find that keeps on happening to your sector, the best solution to that is to participate in benchmarks. The more data we have, the more data we can share and more consistently show it. So I would encourage you to sign up for next year, which you can do at mrbenchmarks.com, and encourage your peers to do so as well. If you're not sure which sector applies to you, you can look up the full list of participants broken out by sector at mrbenchmarks.com, along with all of the rest of the data that we're going to be showing today, and a whole mountain of data we're not going to have time to get to. There's a lot of other tools at mrbenchmarks.com, along with our full analysis and our full data set. There's also a benchmarks yourself tool where you can enter in your own data and compare yourself to the top line numbers. There is a crossword puzzle for you nerds out there that is sort of relevant to our theme today, and a lot of other things as well. So I encourage you to visit the full data set there. We are scheduled to go about an hour and a half today. We are aiming to use the first hour of that to really get through all of our slides here, get through the top line findings, and leave a really healthy amount of time at the end for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A feature in Zoom. We do have a few of our colleagues who are monitoring the QA who will be able to answer questions in real time. So if you need a clarification on what we mean by a particular metric, you can probably get it answered there. For those questions that need a little bit more discussion, we'll be taking those on at the end. And just a couple of quick things in terms of what we mean with some of our common terms here. So first, we talk about averages a lot. Whenever we're talking about averages, we are talking about the median figure. We use that so that we don't see sort of these wild swings based on outlier organizations. So if somebody has a really amazing result, that's not going to necessarily swing the whole average. We also break in addition to sector, we also break down our metrics by size. So when we say size, we are talking about the annual online revenue for that particular participant. So for small nonprofits, those are nonprofits who raise under 500,000 over the course of 2020 online, between 500,000 and 3 million. We consider that a medium group, and then above $3 million in online revenue in 1 year makes you a large group. I described the sectors. And then an important note about year-over-year changes. One of the things that we really are always interested in tracking is what's changing, what's getting better, what's getting worse, where are the metrics moving, those long-term trends. And we do publish a benchmark study every year. What we do not do is go and look at last year's numbers and then compare them to this year's numbers, because those are a different pool of participants. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison. So anytime we are talking about year-over-year changes in this year's benchmarks, we are looking at this year's participants only. So we'll be taking a look back at their data from last year or from previous to that, so that we get a good apples-to-apples comparison. So while we all are very fond of benchmark studies of years past, we leave them in our archives and museums and that sort of thing where it's appropriate. We don't actually do a direct comparison here. And that's it. Let's talk about numbers. So this is the first big headline number of the year. Overall, online revenue for nonprofits grew by 32% in 2020. And that is a really, it's a really extraordinary number. I know that when we saw this, and after we went back and confirmed that it was actually true, it was a really moving kind of experience, I think, for all of us who work on benchmarks every year, because it is a really different number than what we're used to seeing. We've had some exceptional volatility over the last few years, but we have not seen something like this kind of substantial growth happening over the course of 1 year. And I think after the really difficult year that so many people had in 2020, it was honestly, it was moving and emotional to take a look and be like, well, this is what the response to that was. This is it was a reflection of the ways that people saw the hardship around them over the year of 2020, the pandemic, and everything else that went into it. And communities really came together to support each other. Donors came together to say, these are causes that I believe in. My community is suffering, my neighbors are in trouble, and I'm going to do what I can. And that happened again and again and again, and we see it really clearly in the numbers. And I think there's something really, really beautiful and really moving about that kind of performance. And it was not something that was evenly spread. I think we can especially see that COVID response when we take a look at the hunger and poverty sector in particular. These are groups like food banks. These are groups like community aid organizations that are embedded in communities that are trying to help people get by who are struggling. And the response in terms of fundraising for those nonprofits was truly extraordinary, 173% growth over the course of the year relative to 2019 numbers. And that's just an astonishing figure. And it gives me a feeling of hope that when donors see a need in their communities, they're willing to support nonprofits. They're willing to do what they can to help each other, to help the causes that they care about, and to help people get by in times of need. And so as much as we try to be sort of coldly dispassionate about these numbers and just sort of report the facts and see what they are, I think for all of us who work on this, it was like, oh, like even having been through this, even seeing this in the work that we do every day, actually taking a moment to understand that the depth of sort of compassion and generosity that is out there was really inspiring and I think really special. So I think this sort of weirdly outlier numbers that we're seeing for the hunger and poverty groups. We're going to see that repeated several times today. They as a sector, it really outperformed most of its peer groups in so many ways. And I think, again, it's a reflection of people seeing lines of cars at food banks on the evening news and feeling like they needed to do something about that. So COVID was not the only thing that happened in 2020, and it is all over the data. It is something that we see again and again, and it is the sort of central feature of our existences over the last year. We can't escape that context. That really sets the tone for what is happening in the data this year. But 2020 wasn't only COVID. We also saw a rising movement for racial justice that only gained visibility and urgency after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. we saw, and we wanted to see if nonprofits who were turning their attention or had always had their attention on racial justice as an issue saw a different performance. So we asked a question about that. We also have heard over the years concerns from nonprofits that do not engage in electoral work, that when it's a presidential election year, you get squeezed out, that there's just so much focus on the election, on the politics, that those nonprofits that are apolitical have a really hard time breaking through. And so we wanted to take a look at that and see if we could spot signs of that in the data. So we also asked all of our participants to let us know if they had done electoral work within the United States. We specified United States because we do have a substantial number of UK-based organizations within our benchmark study this year, so we wanted to make sure we were sorting that out and not reflecting that very different election and different political context. And then we did want to see if there was a difference in response to those nonprofits who participated in direct relief work around COVID-19, whether that was doing relief work themselves or participating in advocacy around supporting communities, to see if we could spot any differences in the data. So we're going to take these questions one at a time. So the first question, we had a lot of participants across all issue areas, really, that affirmatively said racial justice is a priority, a primary focus of their organization's work. And it didn't just come up as a sort of an affirmative response where you might expect to see it, say, in the rights sector, where there are a lot of groups where sort of their foundational cause is racial justice. We saw it across issue areas of all types. There are nonprofits everywhere who are naming a core part of their work to say that the fight for racial justice is a part of it. And we're hopeful that that reflects a real commitment to meaningful change, and hopefully we're seeing that. What we did not see was any real difference in performance between those groups that answered yes to this question and those groups that answered no to this question. And so on average, they look pretty much the same. So there was not this sort of like really clear indication that either focusing on or not focusing on racial justice in 2020 had any sort of impact on the results we looked at. The next question, whether organizations participated in the election. And here, again, a really similar story. We saw that nonprofits that reported that they did do electoral work did see some small differences, slightly higher average increase in giving. Web traffic was a little bit higher growth number for non-electoral nonprofits. These were all pretty small effects, and it was about all we could look at, and we looked pretty hard. So I think the main takeaway here is that for those nonprofits that have felt in the past, you know, we get squeezed out in the election year. There's nothing we can't break through. We get just drowned out in all the noise around sort of the politics. That didn't seem to be the case, at least in 2020. We never get tired of saying 2020 was an unusual year. And so it is possible that in a different election year, that would not hold true. And it's possible that sort of the impact of COVID wiped out whatever impact might have existed over the election. All we can say for sure here is that it doesn't look like that crowding out effect happened in 2020. And so for those of you who are already planning for 2024, if you're not a political organization, hopefully you get a little bit of encouragement from this, that you can make big plans and see them through. And then the third question was whether organizations participated in COVID relief work. And here we did see a difference, a really clear one. And we saw that the change in online revenue was significantly higher for those nonprofits that did direct COVID relief work than for those who did not. Now, this effect happened entirely within one-time giving. So if you're looking at the chart here, those black lines represent monthly giving. You can see that COVID or not COVID, the increase in monthly giving was 26%. One-time giving was much, much higher. The growth rate for one-time giving was much higher for COVID relief organizations. And this is, I think, in a lot of ways, what feels pretty intuitive, which is it's a disaster response moment. When there's a big disaster, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake, something unexpected, we do tend to see a surge in giving to organizations that are engaged in relief work. Oftentimes that comes as one-time giving because it's about an emergency response. It's less about necessarily a long-term commitment to that cause. And so I think for those of you who are looking at this and being like, yep, that's us, we got a ton of new one-time donors, the question is really about retention. And I expect for many of you, the conversations you've been having over the past year, the conversations that you're having now about your strategy, about your approach, your content, all of that are largely focused around, well, these people who stood up and made unusual one-time gifts, who gave to us who've never given before, who made larger gifts, who made second gifts. How do we get them to stick around? How do we stay relevant for that with them? That's the work of sort of this ongoing response. COVID is not something, obviously, that is in the rearview mirror. So I think there is a lot of opportunity here to continue to demonstrate that relevance and to work on retention. I think that's going to be a big focus for a lot of folks who are seeing this kind of results. I'm going to hand it over to Theresa now to tell us a little bit more about digital ads.
Great. Thank you, Will. So as Will said, I am going to talk to you about digital ads. Here are the biggest headlines for digital ads, and I'll be digging into these a bit over the next few slides. But to summarize, in 2020, nonprofits increased their spending on digital ads by 33%. They spent 10 cents for every dollar that they raised in overall online revenue. And I know that's a confusing metric. So just to be clear, that isn't ROI. It's just a measure of their ads budget relative to total online revenue. So just to give you a sense of how much groups are spending. Most of the spending in 2020 was for direct fundraising ads, with a quarter spent on branding awareness or education and 14% for lead generation. The return on ad spend, or ROAS, was highest for search ads, followed by social media, display, and then video. And cost to acquire a new lead was $2.60. Okay, so digging in 2020, nonprofits increased their spending on digital ads by 33%. The largest increases were for the health sector at 88% and the hunger poverty sector with a 79% increase. Given the trends in the news that Will talked about and the trends we saw with online revenue, this really doesn't surprise me that we saw this type of increase, especially in those sectors. Cultural and environmental groups actually decreased their investment year over year. And you can see that 60% decrease in spending from cultural groups is not a huge surprise, given that many of those groups in that sector no longer were advertising to get folks to visit or for other purposes. And when did groups spend their ads budgets? So groups spent almost a third of their ads budget in December. You can see that huge spike at the end of the year, which tracks. That's when groups were focusing on Giving Tuesday and end of year with a large portion of their budget in December. There's also a small spike in June, which we think is a lot when a lot of groups have their fiscal year end and probably are ramping up ads budgets then. And you can see that the spikes here, the larger sections, are mostly driven by social and display, and those are both shown in the shades of pink on this chart. So for ad budget priorities, so where groups were spending their budgets, that really varied by organization size. Groups with an annual online revenue of $3 million or more, they focused on fundraising as their goal, and they invested in display ads as their largest channel. But small groups, so those with budgets under $500,000 a year, focused on branding and awareness and spent most of their budgets on social media. This is probably because large groups don't need to focus as much on brand awareness, and small groups might have a harder time investing in display ads because it can be cost prohibitive. And here is the table that shows the numbers I just mentioned with the relative investment for each of those categories. So you can really see the differences here in what large and small groups invest in and what channels they focus on. Again, large groups focused on fundraising and investing in display ads. Small groups are focused on branding and awareness and spent more on social media. And what resulted from that spending? So for cost per donation, display and video ads were more expensive than search, with social media right in the middle. And on the other side, the return on ad spend, or ROAS, that was lowest for display and video and highest for search, again with social media in the middle. That said, a lot of nonprofits might see that and think, like, great, let's put all of our budget into search. But doesn't quite work that way. Search is not as scalable as display, which is why search spending tends to be so consistent throughout the year. And we saw that in that monthly spending chart. There's really a limit how much can be reasonably spent on search for most nonprofits. There are only so many people typing in a relevant search term into Google or Bing to find an organization. And after groups have saturated that search, they really have to look to other channels. So those other channels like social and display ads, they can be run at much higher volume and can really be scaled up. So when nonprofits try to expand reach during key moments like end of year or around important news events, they were able to increase investments in social and display because they are scalable. And you can see all of those numbers again here. For the cost per donation, display and video ads were more expensive than search. And then on the other side there, the ROAS was lowest for display and video and highest for search. And small groups saw a higher cost per donation than large groups, except for on social media. But the return on ad spend that we just discussed, that's just one way to evaluate ads. So a supporter might see an Instagram story ad, and then they see a display ad while they're browsing the news. And they might not click on either of those, but then they might search for an organization, click on the search ad and give. And donations like those from supporters who were served ads but landed on donation pages through some other means, those are attributed as view through revenue. And that made up 24% of all digital ads giving in 2020. But if an attribution model only accounts for the last touch, a search ad gets all the credit for that gift, even if social media and display ads played a role in prompting that gift. Now, I know that that all sounds complicated and messy, and there aren't really clear lines there. And what works for one organization may not work for another. But the nice part of digital advertising is that nonprofits can better understand who they're talking to and reach out to those audiences wherever they are and respond to what those actions that tell us the actions that they tell us they care about. Okay, moving on from digital ads, now to talk about text messaging. So for text messaging, we're really reporting on two main types of communications. The first is bulk mobile messaging, which are texts sent directly from nonprofits to a list of subscribers. And those are more similar to email or direct mail. The other type of text messaging we report on is peer-to-peer text messaging. So instead of a single mass message sent to a full list, these messages connect volunteers or staff organizers to individual list members. And these really enable one-on-one conversations. So here are your headlines for the text messaging. Again, I'll dig into these more in the next few slides. So mobile audiences grew by 26% in 2020. Groups had 50 mobile subscribers for every 1,000 email subscribers. We'll talk in a couple slides about how the mobile rates compare to email metrics. And then we'll also talk about this peer-to-peer text message volume and results. So compared to email, mobile audiences were much smaller. So groups only had 50 mobile subscribers for every 1,000 email subscribers, but they grew much faster than email in 2020. Audience sizes for those types of messages grew by 26% in 2020. Email list sizes, however, which I know I'm getting ahead of myself, we'll talk about emails in the next section, but email list sizes only grew by 3% in that time period. So these really are a much faster growing audience. In addition to it growing, mobile messaging had higher levels of interaction than email messaging. Again, will dive into those email rates in the next section. So you'll hear more about those, but to give you a little preview, the click-through rates for mobile fundraising messages, the click-through rate was 6% compared to an email fundraising click-through rate of just 1.7%. And the click-through rate for mobile advocacy messages was 10%, while email was only 3.3%. Unfortunately, because of the way that mobile messaging platforms connect to donation platforms, we don't always have reliable data on fundraising response rates, but we can say from what we're able to measure that mobile messaging definitely got attention and got clicks, and usually at higher rates than fundraising or than email messaging, sorry. Okay, now to talk about the other type of mobile messaging that I mentioned. This is the peer-to-peer messaging. So the volume of peer-to-peer messaging was relatively steady in 2020, with groups sending 1.2 messages per subscriber per year. And that was actually just a 1% increase from 2019. So basically the same. But users still might have gotten a lot more of these types of messages because more groups were sending them. Our data also doesn't capture candidates or political parties who surely increased their message volume in 2020. Anecdotally, as a person living in a swing state in 2020, I was pretty familiar with this type of message, or many of these messages every day, coming from lots of different organizations and lots of different candidates. And here are the rates for the peer-to-peer text messaging. The response rate for peer-to-peer mobile messages was 9.8%. That was a decline of 27% from 2019. As a note, response here means something a little bit different than for other channels. For a fundraising email, the response rate measures the percentage of recipients who complete a donation. For peer-to-peer texting, we mean a literal response. So the user responded to a text of their with a text message of their own to the person who sent the message. And that response that we count could actually represent a longer conversation happening with that supporter, depending what the groups are messaging about. You'll also see the opt-out rate here is 3.3%, and that increased 37% in 2020. All that said, for these types of messages, we think with rising volume and declining response rates and increasing opt-out rates, that's probably going to lead to some restriction from carriers. So keep an eye out for that if you're a group that does this type of peer-to-peer text messaging. We think that's probably coming down the line. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Will to talk about those email metrics,
which have already been spoiled very rudely by Theresa in her previous section, but we'll have some new things that we can cover as well. I've been a part of our annual benchmark study for many years now, not as long as Theresa. And almost every year, what we report is this gradual long-term decline in email-specific metrics, things like open rates, click-through rates, response rates. And that's really not the case this year. We saw improvements in just about every metric that we track. We also saw list sizes grow a bit by about 3%. And we saw an average of 59 messages go out, which is an increase of 17% in messaging volume, 59 messages per subscriber per year. So if you're subscribed to one list, you'd get about 60 messages over that year. And lucky for you if you're subscribed to one list. Response rate is sort of the core number that we track. That's the percentage of email recipients who completed the main ask in an email, whether that's signing a petition or making a gift. As always, we saw a higher response rate for advocacy messaging than for email or for fundraising messaging. It was 3.6% response rate for advocacy messages in 2020 compared to a 0.10% for fundraising email. I'm going to dig through a little bit of how we get to all that. Email audiences were a bit bigger. They grew by 3%. Nonprofits sent more email to those folks. That volume increased by about 17%. And the message by message, click by click, user by user metrics that we track all improved. It's pretty amazing that all of those things went up at the same time. Often what we see are that bigger audiences tend to depress a little bit your response rate. Higher volume may depress your individual metrics for a particular email message. We didn't see that. We can also see that there are some major differences here by sector. Public media sent the most messages. It was driven by 58 newsletters, so a little bit more than one newsletter a week. I'm not sure why that is. Just very excited for some weeks, doing 2. You can also see that for most sectors, fundraising is a much bigger part of the messaging stream than advocacy, except for groups in the rights and health sectors, which both saw on average more than 20 advocacy messages sent over the course of the year. Rights and environmental, not rights and health. Yeah, so that's the mix. When we look at when these messages are sent out, overall, it's not a surprise. December is the highest volume month of the year. That is when so many of us are sending out several fundraising messages with a December 31st deadline, and that volume really tracks. Cultural messages, cultural nonprofits did see these sort of like individual to that sector spikes in February and in May. That could be a reflection of sort of sounding the alarm around closures and attendance limits and restrictions around COVID around February. And then as we started getting a better sense of how long those restrictions might be in place, May would be another time when culturals might have felt a need to do additional messaging. Cultural nonprofits oftentimes are things like museums, zoos, places that have a physical footprint that people would ordinarily want to go visit. And we'll see a little bit about in a bit how ticket sales also change over the course of the year. May was also a really high volume month for international aid and disaster relief organizations, as well as public media. So again, the assumption here is that this is related to the cycle of sort of when the news was really breaking through around COVID and the changes that were happening all around us. So here's how it works if you're an email fundraiser. You come up with a messaging strategy, you write up some amazing copy, you design a fabulous fundraising message, you send it out to your carefully targeted list, and for every 1,000 email inboxes that you hit, you receive about $78 in revenue back. That is how much work goes into getting that $78. It's a sign of how important volume is to a successful email program. It's just that's a small number to a big audience, and so the bigger we can make our audiences and the more relevant we can make our content, the higher that number is going to go. That does represent a 35% increase from 2019, which is, as with many of the increased numbers we're seeing today, a really remarkable increase, much beyond what we would typically see. But yeah, it is again a sign of how important list acquisition and list hygiene is. So much of what a successful program is reaching the right people at the right time, and that really means reaching as many of the right people as we can. So yes, I keep on saying this, and Theresa already spoiled it also. All of these numbers are really pretty good, which is rare to be able to say. And we see this again. So open rates went up overall by about 9%. Click-through rates increased for advocacy messages and newsletters, actually declined just a bit for fundraising. That's one of the few spots where we saw a decline. Page completion rates increased, response rates went up. Unsubscribe rates went down, but they're shown in the bluish green color because it's a good thing when unsubscribe rates go down typically. So, but those are actually declines for the most part. All of these are the kinds of numbers that we would want to see when we're doing our reporting. Not all of this is COVID. I think that the circumstances that we were all in last year definitely had probably the biggest role here. A lot of these email numbers are also going to be a reflection of what you all are doing in running your programs. A lot of that is list hygiene. So cutting out non-responsive email addresses, sending to targeted audiences, all of that remains really important. Keep doing that if you're doing it. If you're not doing it as well as you think you could, you should work on it. It's important. But I don't think you can separate the numbers out from the context of last year, when so many people were maybe paying a little more attention than they were otherwise, were maybe spending a little more time in front of their computers or their phones than they would otherwise, and feeling like they really wanted to connect with causes that they cared about, and really trying to do what they could to help. One note here is just a weird number in looking through it is response rate in advocacy emails is actually slightly higher than the click-through rate, which is weird. The click-through rate is a percentage of recipients who clicked on a message. The response rate is the percentage of recipients who actually completed the action. This is an artifact of having some groups that were able to report click data, but not response data. And so we have slightly different denominators there. So that's why the number looks a little bit off. Both of those numbers are accurate for the reporting groups that we have. So there's a saying that you might have heard, donors donate. It's sort of a truism in our industry. And the idea is that audiences and individuals that have a history of giving to your organization in the past are more responsive than prospects who have never given before. Those people who are on your list but aren't donors yet. And it seems sort of obvious, right? Donors donate. Of course, the people who tend to give tend to give. And the reasons for that might be complicated. These audiences might be wealthier, for one thing. They might be more able to give. They might be more committed to your issue or organization. They might have been paying attention to you longer. Lots of reasons why you would say donors tend to donate. Prospects, you got to work harder for them. But we wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And what we found was that, yes, donor audiences did tend to give at higher rates than prospect audiences in response to fundraising emails. But the difference is all confined to the landing page. And that I think is super interesting and really points in a direction for some experimentation and strategic thinking. So here is how we broke out the numbers. So at the top row here, you're looking at donors. You see a 22% open rate. It's pretty big. It's a bit better than the 18% for prospect audiences. It's right below it. Not a huge difference. Okay. Then you look at the next step. So that's how many people opened relative to the audience size. What percentage of the people who received this message actually clicked? And there we actually see prospects slightly outperforming donor audiences, but essentially the same. 1.6% of donor audiences clicked on a fundraising message, 1.7% of prospect audiences did. So they're actually clicking through at similar rates. and then they land on the donation page. And that's where the difference is. 32% of donor audiences who clicked through, so the percentage of people who landed on that page, 32% of them actually made their gift. They actually completed that process. And just 8% of prospects did the same. So that's where you see the difference between donors donate and prospects you have to work harder for. It's happening at that stage of the process on that landing page itself. And so the difference in response rates, which you can see, 0.29%, 0.05%, that is being driven entirely by the page completion rate, or almost entirely. And so what that reflects is how likely a person is who clicked through to actually complete their gift. I don't think that there's a single explanation for that. It may be things that are technical. Donors might already have their donation information, their payment information stored with you, and so that just reduces friction. That could have an impact. Prospects might need a little more convincing, and so it may be that different content on the page would actually do a better job of moving prospects. Sometimes you see adding a little more content, a little more context to your case for giving can help to move prospects. This may also be partly about what's happening in the email itself before the person clicks, and doing a really great job of setting that context, those expectations for the prospects, so that we can get them to act a little bit more like donors. There's a lot to dig into. There's not going to be a single explanation, but I think this is a really interesting finding and something that really bears a lot of thinking about in terms of figuring out what we can do at that intersection of an email being clicked on and a donation page being completed to get prospects to perform a little bit more like donors. I'm going to shift focus a little bit here and take a look at membership and ticket sales. So this is still email messaging, but specifically around membership and tickets. These aren't going to be a part of everyone's program. So if this is not you, you can go get a snack, I guess, for the next like 2.5 minutes. But they are really important for those groups that rely on membership and ticket sales as part of their programs. So just to set the context of what we mean, when we are talking about membership in the context of benchmarks, we are looking at membership that has a defined, tangible benefit. So things like tote bags and a branded water bottle, getting family admission to the zoo or museum all year long, that sort of membership. We're not talking about the sort of symbolic memberships that a lot of nonprofits have, where you get maybe just like a paper card in the mail, and then you get to be a member of that organization when you give. Those programs can be really important. They can be really successful. It's just a different kind of animal than what we're talking about here. We're really talking about membership that has a tangible benefit attached to it. With ticket sales, we are looking specifically at admission to a regularly occurring thing. That could be a zoo or a museum, a place that you can go to regularly. We are not talking about one-off event tickets like a gala that you might be doing once a year. That's not the kind of tickets we're talking about here. Or I guess like a virtual gala is what you would have had last year. We're not talking about those tickets. We're talking about a place you can go to ordinarily. Okay, so the top line thing here to know, to pay attention to, ticket sales really suffered in 2020. Membership programs tended to hold pretty strong. So in 2019, we saw pretty modest growth, 6% in ticket sales online, a little bit better than the year before. Some of that may have been a shift from offline to online. Some of that might just be growing programs. Things are looking pretty great. 2020 happened. And then suddenly we saw online ticket revenue just fall off a cliff. It declined by almost 60%. And so for those nonprofits that rely on ticket sales, that rely on attendance to their venues, that is a huge hole in the budget. And it makes sense, I think, given the experience we all had in the last year. If people don't feel comfortable visiting, if they aren't allowed to travel, if you have exhibitions that are closed or you have attendance limits, ticket sales are bound to suffer. And we're seeing that here. It's a huge drop. It's one that a lot of cultural institutions in particular have been forced to grapple with. So I encourage you all, if you have not already, get vaccinated. Let's support the organizations that have these, that rely on these ticket sales, help them get through the next few months, and so we can start visiting again. Membership is a really different story. So for a lot of nonprofits, membership is sort of directly tied to attendance. If I become a member of my local science museum, I get to take the kids there all year long to get to look at the dinosaurs. It's a great afternoon out. So there are membership programs that are really tied to that. But there are many other kinds of member benefits. Many of them are that tote bag, that water bottle. And it may just be that part of what help memberships stay healthy in terms of a program, continue to grow, is that it is a way to support an organization, even if you can't take advantage of those benefits. It may be feeling a little bit more secondary for those people who are members. So we did see a 70% increase, which is great growth, obviously. We did see membership messaging is often targeted at reliable audiences. So when we're looking at membership emails in particular, we saw that it outperformed ticket sales emails and non-membership fundraising emails. So don't become a member, but do make a gift of $50 or whatever it might be. Part of this may be about targeting. So membership audiences, whether they're existing membership or really high value prospects that you think are likely to become members, tend to be targeted at reliable audiences. So you see really great response rates from those audiences. And we did see that sort of thing. It's also worth pointing out that non-membership fundraising appeals. So for nonprofits that do have a membership program, but also send just direct one-time giving asks, that sort of thing, grew by 110%. Pretty astonishing growth rate, more than doubled the response rate for those non-membership fundraising messages. That looks to me like organizations really doing an effective job of making that case for giving during a difficult year and getting people to make either additional gifts if they're already members or making gifts instead of a membership gift and seeing that performance really strong. So let's take a look at this again. Audiences opened and clicked on ticket messaging at decent rates. We did see, good open rates, good click-through rates for ticket sales messages. But when it comes to the page completion rate, only 1% of people who landed on a ticket sales website actually completed a purchase. That is, I think, impossible to disentangle from the experience of COVID. It's also worth noting that page completion rate is actually significantly higher than we saw in the previous year. So there's a little bit of just, I think it's naturally, it seems like the underlying difficulty of closing those ticket sales for these audiences. Some of this might be people visiting to see what are the rules around visiting, when they could come, just trying to plan a visit, but not being really ready to make that purchase. And here, this is what I was just mentioning with the difference in membership and non-membership fundraising. So the page completion and response rate are about twice as high for membership. And again, some of that might be the value of the member offer. Some of it might just be about targeting and sending these messages to higher value prospects more likely to give folks. The fundraising response rate did double. I think it's really amazing. I think it shows a willingness of people to give in ways that they might not have in the past. And I think it's also an indication that nonprofits are doing a great job of making that case for giving, of giving people different options for how to support their causes. I'm going to hand it over to Theresa to talk about social media.
Great, thanks, Will. All right, so let's talk about social media. Here are the social media headlines. Again, I'll go into these in more detail in the coming slides. Nonprofits had more followers on Facebook than on Twitter or Instagram. Facebook engagement didn't vary much by day of week or post type. Facebook fundraisers continued to grow in 2020 with huge growth in the hunger poverty sector. And Facebook fundraisers accounted for 1.3% of all online revenue. So here we are with the relative audience sizes compared to email list sizes. So for every 1,000 email subscribers, groups had 817 Facebook fans, 291 Twitter followers, and 149 Instagram followers. These reflect the overall user base and the relative maturity of each of those channels. So Facebook's been around for longer than the others, so it's now growing at a slower rate. But that's not true for all nonprofits or even for all sectors. So you can see wildlife, animal welfare nonprofits had the largest Facebook and Instagram audiences relative to email list size by quite a bit, probably because, cute animals are pretty compelling. But having large potential audience is not the same thing as actually reaching those folks in social media. Unlike email, SMS, or direct mail, social media platforms control who sees what through algorithms. So on Facebook, an organic post by a nonprofit reached only 4% of their fans. So that means the vast majority of a nonprofit's Facebook fans didn't get served an individual post. On the flip side, 29% of the audience that did see a post were not already fans. So we're not just reaching the audiences that we already know when we post to social media. And that means that it's really important to think about both fans and non-fans when you're posting. Make sure you're including enough context for audiences who might not already be following you. In order to expand that reach, many nonprofits relied on paid post promotion. So in 2020, 2% of nonprofit posts had some sort of paid reach. So that could include boosted posts or other paid reach on Facebook. Okay, on to engagement score. Because of Facebook's tendency to limit post reach, like we just talked about, based on the algorithms, Facebook engagement rates can sort of be all over the map and they're less useful to benchmark. So to get a more stable figure, we look at the number of users who interacted with a post as a percentage of the page fans on the day the content was posted. By this measure, the average Facebook engagement score was 0.32%. So if a nonprofit had 100,000 fans, they posted a piece of content, that post would receive an average of 320 likes, clicks, or shares for engagement. But you can see some real variation between how sectors performed for that in 2020. So we see health, public media, and hunger and poverty groups with higher Facebook engagement scores. Again, likely related to everything happening in 2020. Those three sectors probably had more engagement related to that. Additionally, we saw engagement scores decline by over 21% from 2019. But some sectors saw huge increases. You can see the change in those numbers on the website for that chart. We really think that's just a factor of Facebook algorithms and how they change year over year and how they control who will engage with a nonprofit's content. As I said before, we looked at how engagement score varied by type of media and by day of week. And as you can see, there wasn't a lot of variation for the average for either of these things. So the Facebook page engagement score by type of media, we can see that range pretty close to that 0.32% overall. And engagement score by day of week, they really stay like pretty close to that as well. Not a lot of variation. Okay, so Twitter engagement rate. This is a little bit different than the Facebook engagement score. Twitter provides a direct report of the engagement here, and the platform defines that as total engagements per post divided by post reach. In 2020, the average Twitter engagement rate was 1.8%, with wildlife animal welfare nonprofits as a big outlier at 2.9%. Again, those cute animals, they're going to get you more engagement on Twitter. Now to talk about Facebook fundraisers. So overall, revenue from Facebook fundraisers increased by 14% in 2020. But as you can see here, groups in the hunger poverty sector saw an increase of 946% in revenue from Facebook fundraisers. This is another one of those metrics that when I saw it, I was, as Will was talking earlier, for the overall increase, like I was really moved when I saw this. I think particularly with Facebook fundraisers, this is a type of giving that's really driven by people. This isn't just nonprofit strategy. This is the effort and impact of thousands of individual supporters starting Facebook fundraisers, asking friends to join them, giving to a cause they care about. People really saw a need in 2020 and they stepped up and tried to get their friends to step up as well. Okay, not to just use car metaphors because I'm in Detroit, but to switch gears a little on to website performance. Here are the headlines. Half of all nonprofit website visits came from users on mobile devices. That was up 9% in 2020. Desktop users made up the majority of transactions and revenue. Organic traffic was 42% of nonprofit website visits, and 0.08% of organic visitors made a donation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference in behavior from users on different devices. So not all visits are equally likely to result in fundraising success. Half of all traffic was from users on mobile devices in 2020, and that was a 9% increase from 2019. But desktop users were more likely to give and had a higher average gift than mobile or tablet users. And although mobile visitors were half of the traffic, They made only 35% of the donations, accounted for only 25% of the revenue. So more nonprofit traffic is visiting on mobile devices, and that traffic is less valuable in terms of revenue than desktop traffic. Obviously, there are other important reasons for folks to be visiting sites, but in terms of revenue, more of it is coming from desktop users. So all of that makes it pretty clear that there continues to be a need to optimize the mobile experience and to remove barriers to giving on mobile devices. And lastly, for website metrics, organic website traffic, which that's traffic from non-paid search results, that accounted for 42% of all visitors in 2020. So for organic visitors, for those, that 42% of all visitors, 0.08% completed a gift. And that amounted to an average of 12 cents of revenue per organic visitors. To me, this means there's a huge opportunity here. With such a large share of traffic, improving these numbers, that 0.08% or that 12 cents of revenue per visitor, improving those numbers just a little bit can really make a very big difference.
That's it. That's all the information that we need to share. I told you we'd get through it in an hour. We do have plenty of time for questions, for discussions, for thoughts, for sharing. If we run out of time, I can try to juggle. A couple of quick things, quick notes before we get to those questions. Please, you can start dropping them into the Q&A function right now. As you gather those questions, for those participants who joined us today, first, I want to say thank you again for being a part of Benchmarks. You will be receiving your print copies and your individual results reports in the next few weeks. For those of you who did not participate and are suddenly jealous of the participating nonprofits who are receiving print copies and individualized reports, we would love to have you next year. You can let us know you're interested, again, at mrbenchmarks.com. There's a sign up for next year link right in the left nav. You don't have to commit right now. Obviously, it's a long way away. But if you have questions about what participating means, we will get back to you and be happy to answer any of those questions. And now we are open for questions. Please do visit. There's a lot more data than we were able to get through here. A lot more charts, a lot more analysis, hidden fun Easter eggs all over that website. So please do go check it out. And if you think of something tomorrow or the next day that you want to share with us after this is over, please do find us on Twitter at MR Campaigns. And thanks for joining.
Yeah, so are you guys ready for some questions? We've got quite a few.
Hi, who's talking?
Hi, it's Karen from M+R, and I have some questions for you.
I don't introduce yourself, Karen.
Oh, yes. I introduced myself in the chat. I just assumed that everyone still knew, but that's okay. Hi, I'm Karen Hopper. I'm the Senior Data Strategist here at M+R, and I've been helping in the questions box and also have been grabbing some questions to field of our two experts here. So first, we have some questions where I think we're just going to ask you to speculate a little bit, which is always my favorite part of benchmarks. Interesting that orgs who didn't do electoral work didn't get crowded out in an electoral year, but that's usually the case. Could this be some part attributed to nonprofits wading into politics more than usual? And so this is someone who works at a progressive nonprofit who doesn't do electoral work, but also didn't shy away from talking about the previous administration's impact on our lives. So do you think that that had an impact in smoothing out this election year?
I'm going to say maybe, which is my favorite answer to give when we're asked to speculate. So I think a couple of things in the data that are worth mentioning. So one, we did not, I don't think, and Theresa will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we actually saw a big increase in advocacy messaging volume over the course of 2020 relative to 2019. So at least from that perspective of like, are you talking about issue-based stuff a lot and trying to get people to engage politically or like off to the side of politically adjacent? We didn't see it there. And so I think that there may be other factors at play here. I think it's an open question whether people are able to continue to support nonprofits at the same rate that are not political in a presidential year. I know that we've definitely heard that a bunch in the past, but we didn't look at it in 2016, and so we're not able to compare to the previous presidential election year. We'll absolutely be tracking this again, so we'll see you again, I guess, in 4 years, and we'll see if we can confirm that lack of crowding out effect again. My guess is if 2020 was different politically, or in terms of the performance for non-political nonprofits than other presidential years, it probably is more due to folks just paying more attention to other charitable causes in the context of COVID, paying attention to racial justice, paying attention to the need around them to support the causes they cared about. Probably less tied, I would say, to the sort of individual messaging strategies or a willingness to wade into politics for sort of apolitical groups.
Yeah, Will, to follow up on that advocacy question, we actually saw a 9% decline in messages per year for advocacy messages.
See, I almost memorized all the numbers.
Cool. So this is somewhat related, but did the ads ban on political issues on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Google have some impact on performance? Was any analysis done with that political ad ban in mind?
I can jump in to help on this one. Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm a media director on our ads team at M+R. So we didn't include those questions specifically in our benchmarks, but we definitely saw that the ban on Facebook had some impact across several of our clients. I would say the actual impact of it though, like really ran the gamut across our different clients. Some that are like really involved, like they have to name a candidate or they have to name something that's very electoral, really took a hard hit where they could only had like a handful of ads that they could get approved on Facebook, and therefore their performance and their spending definitely went down. Many of our clients though were able to get creative approved that kind of through the political ban and allowed Facebook to actually get it approved. So we tried a couple different things to make sure that we could get as many creatives approved as possible. And for those clients, we actually saw a pretty standard performance to what we've seen in past years. And those clients actually were able to spend more because all of the electoral clients weren't spending anything. So they were able to get really cheap CPMs and had really strong performance on Facebook.
It's really nice that we have ringers we can phone a friend if we don't know the answers to things. Thanks, Kristen.
No problem. And I'm like, while Kristen's here, I'm going to hit you with another ads question. Were the digital ads analyzed for this study primarily with Google and Facebook? And are there any emergent ad platforms among nonprofits?
Yeah, so most of the search and the social spend that are in benchmarks is coming from Facebook/Instagram. We usually do Facebook and Instagram together. And then the search spend is primarily coming from Google. A lot of our clients are interested in like trying out other platforms to try to get off Facebook and Google as much as possible, given all of the bans that are happening. We tested many different things, but Google and Facebook do continue to be the top performers across the board. Some success we've seen with some other platforms would be YouTube, which is still Google, but a different platform. And then native, as well as some like incentive sites, like mobile gaming opportunities. But net, there's no like good replacement for Facebook, and you'll probably still have to spend there.
Yeah, so on the note about Facebook, we had a few questions about why we're still spending on Facebook. We know that that's where a lot of our audience is, but aren't nonprofits, and I quote, pretty invisible there?
So your organic posts are going to be pretty invisible there, but I would still recommend spending there with paid media and paid ads. You'll definitely get presence to your specific audiences. Actually, a lot of the times what we'll see is we have a specific group of people that we want to target, and they will pretty much only get ads from nonprofits because they've been identified as someone who's interested in giving and interested in charities. So for example, I get pretty much only nonprofit ads all day, every day on Facebook. I think the larger question though, like across the board, is more from an ethical perspective on if we want to be spending on Facebook or not, which I really think is more of a client by client decision.
Yeah, that big hairy ethical question. So staying on the topic of social media, this is probably kicking it back to Will and Theresa, but what is the North Star for measuring success on social? Is it engagement? Like, are impressions even worth anything these days?
I think it depends on what your goals are. I think that there are, I think for many nonprofits, especially for smaller, more local ones, you may be actually engaging really closely with volunteers, with organizers, with folks who are in your community that it's really important to keep in touch with, and that may be the main way that you're keeping in touch with them. It is a way of broadening your message. I think as Kristen noted, and as we've seen, the visibility of any given post that you put up, in particular on Facebook, is pretty low amongst organically, unless you're paying to promote that content. And so I think it is hard to say, to predict an outcome when you put out one particular piece of content. So generally, what we're trying to do is have whatever is your non-paid social media content be a part of a broader multi-channel effort. I mean, it feels like a boring cliche to say you should be in all channels telling a similar narrative, but it remains the case that folks who are on your email list are also very likely to be on your social media channels. They're also maybe going to be visiting your website. They may be visiting you in person if that's the thing that happens for your organization. There are all these different channels. We want to make sure that we're staying in touch in the places that are convenient to our audiences, not necessarily in the places that we feel like spending our time.
Great. So staying on the topic of like, how do we even normalize all of these different metrics across all of these different audiences and these different places we are? How do you equalize email metrics across all these organizations, taking into account like different list hygiene practices and also some incredible list growth that people have had this year?
I can take this one. So that's a great question. And one of the big challenges with benchmarks is working with lots of different size organizations who are at various levels of maturity in their programs. We do a couple things. First, we ask for 2 different types of lists when we ask for list size information, which helps, which that we are asking for kind of full email list size, so total reachable audience, or we ask in addition for total reachable audience minus inactive audiences. And when we're talking about list sizes, we prefer to use that minus inactive audience. There are still a number of groups who participate in the study who don't suppress any inactives, and so they only have one version of that list. In that case, their metrics probably vary as well. The big note I'll also say is that, as Will mentioned earlier, we had a lot of participants from the UK this year, 55 UK participants, and they operate under different legal guidelines. They have GDPR, and so they have cleaner email lists in general. And so we will be putting out a different study about the UK groups, but we do think that part of that is also that they generally are going to have sort of higher rates across different metrics because they are not sending to inactives. And I see a question that I'll just follow up with. That was, which time frame do you what time frame do you use to declare an email subscriber as inactive? We just ask groups to define it how they define it. So that varies by organization. Maybe someone else can give some examples of ones, but it's, it might be they haven't opened an email in 6 months, they haven't opened an email in 12 months, they haven't taken an action within a certain amount of time. It varies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say most of our groups will keep donors on file for a year or 2 is generally what we see before they declare that email as inactive if they haven't opened or clicked on an email. And then for new joins or new prospects, if they don't engage with email right away, they are much more likely to be put in an inactive file more quickly if they don't, come through and take an action or show that email address is attached to a human. Because as probably a lot of you know, deliverability is a huge concern with spam traps and making sure that we're actually keeping our ISPs healthy or our ESPs healthy. So it's a messy technical situation right now. While I'm talking, I'm just going to take a few of these website related questions. So the first one is about advocacy forms on mobile versus desktop. So we don't actually look at that as part of this benchmark study. And the reason being is that it's actually pretty hard to get that calculation. as a way that we can compare apples to apples for all of our organizations. We do all of our device reporting and our website reporting out of Google Analytics. And in order to pull an advocacy completion rate, we would need to know the number of times any advocacy forms were submitted on a website, which is a fairly difficult and time-consuming thing to do if the event tracking is not set up to do that. If you have questions about setting up events in Google Analytics, hit us up on Twitter, and we can definitely help you along there. I love to geek out about Google Analytics, so happy to spend some time talking about that. And then the other question that we got about website giving is about desktop versus mobile, and that desktop giving is more popular than mobile, and our recommendation here is to optimize for mobile. And the reason that our recommendation is to optimize for mobile instead of just optimizing for desktop is because we're seeing such a huge growth in mobile traffic. We saw a 9% growth year over year. The majority of most websites are now seeing their more than 50% of all visitors coming through on a mobile device, and giving up on all those people and not asking them to donate and not giving them a convenient way to donate is kind of just, for lack of better terms, like kind of like lighting money on fire almost, because like we're just essentially giving up on trying to convince them that we're a worthy organization and that they should support us. And so, yes, it is really important to optimize your donation form for a desktop visitor, but keeping in mind that the more people are going to be seeing your website on mobile, and that's only going to increase over time. So I'm going to hand it back over to Theresa and Will to talk about email metrics some more. Why do we look at click-through rate as the number of clicks over the number of email recipients instead of click-to-open rate?
I can take this. Traditionally, we just find the open rates are not as consistent in the reported metric because they are tracked through click pixels, and different CRMs track those in different ways. So we generally like to rely on recipients because we think that's a much more stable denominator for click-through and response rates.
Cool. And following up on that, what is the average list size used for our email benchmarks?
That's a great question that I don't know offhand.
Whoever asked that gets a prize. They stumped
I know. Yeah, I don't know offhand.
I do know that we used to do this study based off of email list size, and that we found that it's a better comparison to do it on revenue than email list size, especially with all these changes to like folks using inactive definitions, and it just becomes harder to compare.
And with us measuring so many different channels, it's sort of a funny way to group people if we're talking about digital ads, is that doesn't have as much relation to their email list size.
Yeah. And about list size, we said that list size grew 3% on average. Do you have a breakdown of where that growth came from, or can you speculate?
I do not know. My guess is if we saw a 33% increase with digital ads, there's probably some portion of that that's going toward lead generation. There's some list growth there. Otherwise, we don't know where those things are coming from. There's probably some level of organic signups and other places the lists are growing.
Yeah. And then for someone who is struggling, all caps struggling with email open rates, has anyone found any tips or tricks to stay out of the dreaded promotions tab?
I don't know if there's any tricks. It's in some ways inscrutable. I think where this ends up. Good list hygiene. I mean, the same practices that improve deliverability across the board are what we would recommend. So that's about not sending to inactives, making sure you're sending really relevant content, getting people to engage in whatever ways you can with the content you do send out. I don't know that there's a special silver bullet that's going to solve that problem.
Yeah. I would also just say making sure that you're keeping your email list healthy is like the best way to stay in inboxes. For that, I'm like, I have lost my questions tab. Here's one. Is there an industry-wide attrition rate for email lists? So how many people a year on average become inactive?
So this is, I didn't know this one off the top of my head. So I went to mrbenchmarks.com where we have our full data set, and I looked it right up right here. Our unsubscribe rate on average for the last year was 8.8%. The bounce rate was 7.2%. So like I said, we didn't get to all the data, but we do have information on churn. That's also broken out by sector that you can see there in our very convenient website, which once again is mrbenchmarks.com. That's mrbenchmarks.com.
Amazing. Have we ever considered analyzing data on LinkedIn? Or I'm assuming about LinkedIn engagement and also LinkedIn ads.
Yes, we've considered it. Yes, I mean, every year we take a look at the metrics that we report on, the channels that we're reporting on, the platforms. You know, we weren't doing Instagram a couple of years ago. It's really become a more important channel for a lot of nonprofits, so we started including it. That's sort of how benchmarks evolves and changes over time. Is we're really trying to pay attention to what you all are doing, and so if we start to see a lot of folks finding important engagement and important audiences on LinkedIn, it's something that may well come into benchmarks. If you're interested in influencing that, you could sign up to be a benchmarks participant at mrbenchmarks.com. I'm gonna just keep on pitching it.
Do we have any demographic information about who engaged via text message?
We do not have that information. Something we didn't know when I was talking about the text messaging metrics is we did partner with a couple organizations that, or a few partners who do this. So Hustle and Get Through and Upland Mobile Messaging, and they provided that information. So they did not provide the demographic information this time, but that's definitely an interesting question, and I'm sure plays into that, as well as the other things we talked about for devices. You know, people are on their mobile devices more than they are on other places, and so I am sure that the demographics play into that.
Yeah. We also had a question about TikTok data. Guess we can put that on our list for maybe next year.
Yeah, if we can collect the information, I am interested in reporting on it, if there's enough groups there and if there's ways to report on it.
Cool. It looks like we have a couple more questions about website analytics. So one question is, how do we manage all website analytics for organizations that have different domains for different areas of business? So if you have different domains for advocacy versus donations versus your homepage, where your content lives, the answer to that is to make sure that you have the same Google Analytics tracking on all of those different properties, and they're all sending into the same report. If you're not sending them all into the same report, you end up double counting people that, you know, they start on your homepage and then they go to an advocacy page and then they go to a donation page. If you have them split out in 3 separate Google Analytics properties, that's going to count as 3 different people. But if you have them all set up as one Google Analytics instance and you have cross-domain tracking enabled so that you're basically cooking people as they go from property to property on your site, that way you can keep them all in one report and one reporting in Google Analytics, and it'll help you dedupe that information. If you want to reach out on Twitter, also, I can help you out with some little like Google help information on like how to actually install all of that, because it does get pretty technical pretty quickly on the websites. And then speaking of very technical on websites, we also got a question about Google's page experience update, which is they are releasing a set of new metrics called Core Web Vitals and how that's going to impact SEO. And I think there's really like a whole SEO industry school of thought about what might change and what might not change. The general consensus is that Page speed is really important. If your website loads really slowly, not only will you not do as well in Google search, but you'll also frustrate your users. Most people expect a web page to load in 3 seconds or less. And for every second of additional load time, you lose about 11% of your visitors. So that's the biggest impact, I think, that the core Web Vitals is going to have. And then beyond that, just make sure that you're still like writing for humans, like because humans are doing the searching, humans are looking for answers, humans want to connect with you. And so as long as you're still producing content that a human will search for and a human can read, I think you'll be okay. And so we have one last question, unless folks want to jump in that Q&A box. This is our last one of the day. And it's, what does your crystal ball say about 2021 digital trends? Look into the future.
I was going to let Theresa answer that.
Oh.
The whole fun thing about benchmarks is we can just say things that we know because they happened in the past. I think it's, I mean, to me, I think looking at this data and the clients we work with, the context of 2020 is not going to be the context of 2021. I mentioned this before, the big spike in one-time giving, I think it's going to be really hard for a lot of nonprofits to maintain contact and engagement with those donors who showed up for you all in 2020. And so I think so much depends on the success in finding ways of doing that. Beyond that, I think that the longer term trends that we are seeing, that we've been seeing over time, I think will probably pick up again. It's been a weird few years for all of us in so many ways. I think that some of the long-term trends that we are seeing, maybe there was a little bit of a hiccup in 2020, but probably we'll get back on track, would be things like the growing shift toward monthly giving and the growing importance of that as a part of the overall revenue stream, seeing the shift that we've also talked about a little bit toward more mobile traffic and having the mobile side of the experience be a bigger and bigger share. Those are not things that just started happening. Those are the trends that have continued over time. And so while there may have been a little bit of bumps in the road last year that are maybe hiding some of those effects or heightening them, I think the long-term trends are still around that. And that's around how we communicate with our supporters, which channels they are on, what asks we're making of them, and how they're choosing to engage with us. All those things are interconnected.
And Theresa, what do you think? What's in your crystal ball?
Yeah, everything Will just said. I think the thing that we are looking at for a lot of clients is we're already looking at retention, figuring out how to keep people around. Yeah, I think it's going to be, it'll be interesting. It's always sort of interesting to see how things go back and forth in these years. I know we saw after 2016, we saw interesting growth in 2017. I think we'll just be keeping an eye on it. I'm excited. I'm always excited for benchmarks.
Yeah, Kristen, are you still around? I would love to hear your crystal ball for ads.
Yeah, interesting. That's a good question. I think this year we're probably going to focus on diversifying our mix, like I was talking about earlier. So I imagine when we come to benchmarks next year, hopefully we'll have some additional platforms to report out on. We already talked about TikTok, LinkedIn, like really seeing a lot of our companies trying different things, and then also getting ready for cookie depreciation next year. So maybe that is getting off of display, trying new things in general.
For folks who aren't in digital ads all the time, could you say a little bit more about what cookie depreciation means?
Yes. So right now, when you see a display ad, you have a cookie associated with you, and you might not click on that ad and then go to donate. You might have just seen it, but we can use those cookies to track you a little creepily. And then we'll ultimately be able to see you again on our website where you donated and say, yes, okay, you saw a display ad and now you converted to a donation. That is something that Apple has already depreciated, and now Google is getting rid of cookies for ads tracking in 2022. So that is a big topic for our ads clients, where we're trying to figure out how are we going to report back on things next year, and really, does that mean getting off of display ads? Does that mean accepting a new way of tracking, and really more of a heavy reliance on CRM data for sure?
Yeah. And I'll jump in with my website, Crystal Ball. We already did talk a lot about mobile and how mobile users continue to grow. But my crystal ball is suggesting that there is going to be a lot more of the contactless mobile payment options coming onto the market for nonprofits and nonprofit donation forms. We're already starting to see that at, restaurants and at the drugstore and all sorts of other places where it's like you can just tap your phone, you can just swipe your fingerprint and make a purchase and make a transaction even in person. And so we're going to start seeing our nonprofit tech companies also catch up with that and start offering things like Apple Pay and Google Pay and more of the PayPal Express and that type of thing to make it just easier for people to make donations on mobile devices, which, fingers crossed, that comes sooner rather than later, because we want to make it easier for mobile people. I see there has been one last question about content as part of web performance. So this is another one of those that gets really difficult to track apples to apples across organizations. And that's what we're using as kind of the organic search figures here in our study, is just to show just how much our website content is providing us with traffic to our sites. It's just people often coming to internal content pages. If you look at your Google Analytics report, I will bet you a lot of money that your homepage is not the most visited page on your website. And it's actually one or two of your articles or blog posts or other really informative pages where most people are coming into your site. And so we added organic search, I believe last year or the year before. I remember having these conversations while we were in an office, so who knows when that was. But we wanted to kind of take a step back and say, like, well, how else are we acquiring new potentially interested people? Because, ads are expensive, like we don't have unlimited budgets. We also know that email is more difficult, still effective, but still difficult. And so we're like, where else can we find people to talk to about our mission, about our organization? And one of those channels is organic search. And with that comes content development. Zoom is giving me a no open questions message. Are there any other questions that folks had that my fellow panelists who are also in our document? No? Great.
Such great questions.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us for this time, for sticking with us. I know that this is a big chunk of your day. And thank you again to participants who provided all the data and answered so many of our questions to allow us to put together these materials. Again, I would encourage everybody to go to mrbenchmarks.com. There's a lot more information there, not just a lot of really beautiful charts, which is true, but also a lot more analysis of what this all means and what it might mean for you, as well as additional tools. I mentioned our Benchmarks Yourself tool, which will give you a way to compare your own results in a really clear way so you can ask for more funding from your bosses and bigger budgets. There's also an infographic that combines sort of the top line data here that you can print out. There was a crossword puzzle you can print out and complete. And we also have a link to our relatively new guide to ethical and effective creative that we published a couple of months ago. If you hadn't had a chance to review that, you can also find that in the nav there at mrbenchmarks.com. A lot of really great insights and guidance there in terms of how we can develop creative that is going to get people to do the things we want them to do while still advancing our values. I think that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.